Hello, squirrels. We're 89% of the way through this book. Oh, and my phone's going to go off. Alarms, alarms, alarms. Wait for it to come up. Fiber. And I was on my phone the last time I read, so I gotta get to the right spot. I think we're on chapter 17, is that right, Mrs. Lancaster? Okay, 17, Mrs. Lancaster. Tuppence stood there frowning, and then suddenly, quite unexpectedly, the door opened. Tuppence drew back a step and gasped. The person confronting her was the last person in the world she expected to see. I forgot where she was. And she would go back over to that canal house where the Perrys lived. I guess that's what she did. Particularly wanted to see Alice Perry. Tuppence knocked at the door, rapping first, and nobody answered. She turned there undecided. Wait a minute, there were some questions she wanted badly to ask, blah, blah, blah. So that's where she is. The canal house, and there's Mrs. Lancaster. Last person in the doorway, dressed exactly the same as she had been at Sunny Ridge, and smiling the same way with that air of vague amiability, was Mrs. Lancaster in person. "Oh," said Tuppence. "Good morning. Were you wanting Mrs. Perry?" said Mrs. Lancaster. "It's market day, you know. So lucky I was able to let you in. I couldn't find the key for some time. I think it must be a duplicate anyway, don't you? But do come in. Perhaps you'd like a cup of tea or something." Like one in a dream, Tuppence crossed the threshold. Mrs. Lancaster, still retaining the gracious air of a hostess, led Tuppence along into the sitting room. "Do sit down," she said. "I'm afraid I don't know where all the cups and things are. I've only been here a day or two. Now let me see. But surely I've met you before, haven't I?" "Yes," said Tuppence, "when you were at Sunny Ridge." Sunny Ridge, now. Sunny Ridge, that seems to remind me of something. "Oh, of course, dear Miss Packard. Yes, a very nice place." "You left it in rather a hurry, didn't you?" said Tuppence. "People are so very bossy," said Mrs. Lancaster. "They hurry you so. They don't give you time to arrange things, or pack properly, or anything. Kindly meant, I'm sure. Of course, I'm very fond of dear Nellie Bly, but she's a very masterful kind of woman, I sometimes think," Mrs. Lancaster added, bending forward to Tuppence. "I sometimes think, you know, that she is not quite—" She tapped her forehead significantly. "Of course it does happen, especially to spinsters, unmarried women, you know, very given to good works and all that, but they take very odd fancies sometimes. Curates suffer a great deal. They seem to think sometimes, these women, that the curate has made them an offer of marriage that really he never thought of doing anything of the kind. Oh, yes. Poor Nellie, so sensible in some ways. She's been wonderful in the parish here, and she was always a first-class secretary, I believe, but all the same, she has some very curious ideas at times. Like taking me away at a moment's notice from dear Sunny Ridge and then up to Cumberland, a very bleak house, and again quite suddenly bringing me here." "Are you living here?" said Tuppence. "Well, if you can call it that. It's a very peculiar arrangement altogether. I've only been here 2 days. Before that, you were at Rose Trellis Court in Cumberland." "Yes? Yes, I believe that was the name of it. Not such a pretty name as Sunny Ridge." Do you think? In fact, I never really settled down, if you know what I mean, and it wasn't nearly as well run. The service wasn't as good, and they had a very inferior brand of coffee. Still, I was getting used to things and had found one or two interesting acquaintances there. One of them who knew an aunt of mine quite well years ago in India. It's so nice, when you find connections. It must be, said Tuppence. Mrs. Lancaster continued cheerfully. Now let me see, you came to Sunny Ridge, but not to stay, I think. I think you came to see one of the guests there. My husband's aunt, said Tuppence, Miss Fanshawe. Oh, yes, of course. I remember now, and wasn't there something about a child of yours behind the chimney piece? No, said Tuppence, no, it wasn't my child, but that's why you've come here, isn't it? They've had trouble with the chimney here. A bird got into it, I understand. This place wants repairing. I don't like being here at all. No, not at all, and I shall tell Nellie so as soon as I see her. You're lodging with Mrs. Perry? Well, in a way I am, and in a way I'm not. I think I could trust you with a secret, couldn't I? Oh, yes, said Tuppence, you can trust me. Well, I'm not really here at all. I mean, not in this part of the house. This is the Perry's part of the house. She leaned forward. There's another one, if you go upstairs. Come with me, I'll take you. Tuppence rose. She felt that she was in rather a crazy kind of dream. I'll just lock the door first. It's safer, said Mrs. Lancaster. She led Tuppence up a rather narrow staircase to the first floor. She took her through a double bedroom with signs of occupation, presumably the Perry's room, and through a door leading out of that into another room next door. It contained a washstand, a tall wardrobe made of maple wood, nothing else. Mrs. Lancaster went to the maple wardrobe, fumbled at the back of it, then with sudden ease pushed it aside. There seemed to be casters on the wardrobe, and it rolled out from the wall easily enough. Behind the wardrobe there was, rather strangely, Tuppence thought, a grate. Over the mantelpiece there was a mirror with a small shelf under the mirror on which there were china figures of birds. To Tuppence's astonishment, Mrs. Lancaster seized the bird in the middle of the mantel shelf and gave it a sharp pull. Apparently the bird was stuck to the mantelpiece. In fact, by a swift touch, Tuppence perceived that all the birds were firmly fastened down, but as a result of Mrs. Lancaster's action, there was a click, and the whole mantelpiece came away from the wall and swung forward. Clever, isn't it? Said Mrs. Lancaster. It was done a long time ago, when they altered the house. The priest hole, they used to call this room. But I don't think it was ever really a priest's hole. No, nothing to do with priest. I've never thought so. Come through. This is where I live now. She gave another push. The wall in front of her also swung back, and in a minute or two later they were in a large, attractive-looking room with windows that gave out on the canal and the hill opposite. A lovely room, isn't it? Said Mrs. Lancaster. Such a lovely view. I always liked it. I lived here for a time as a girl, Oh, I see. Not a lucky house, said Mrs. Lancaster. No, they always said it wasn't a lucky house. I think she added. I think I'll shut up this again. One can't be too careful, can one? She stretched out a hand and pushed the door they had come through back again. There was a sharp click as the mechanism swung into place. I hope, said Tuppence, that this was one of the alterations they made to the house. when they wanted to use it as a hiding place. They did a lot of alterations, said Mrs. Lancaster. Sit down, do. Do you like a high chair or a low one? I like a high one myself. I'm rather rheumatic, you know. I suppose you thought there might have been a child's body there, added Mrs. Lancaster. An absurd idea, really. Don't you think so? Yes, perhaps. Cops and robbers, said Mrs. Lancaster with an indulgent air. One is so foolish when one is young, you know, all that sort of thing, gangs, big robberies. It has such an appeal for one when one is young. One thinks being a gunman's moll would be the most wonderful thing in the world. I thought so once. Believe me, she leaned forward and tapped Tuppence on the knee. Believe me, it's not true. It isn't really. I thought so once, but one wants more than that, you know. There's no thrill, really, in just stealing things and getting away with it. It needs good organization, of course. You mean Mrs. Johnson or Miss Bly, whichever you call her? Well, of course, she's always Nellie Bly to me, but for some reason or other, to facilitate things, she says. She calls herself Mrs. Johnson now and then, but she's never been married, you know. Oh, no. She's a regular spinster. The sound of knocking came to them from below. Dear me, said Mrs. Lancaster, that must be the Perrys back again. I'd no idea they were going to be back so soon. The knocking went on. Perhaps we ought to let them in, suggested Tuppence. No, dear, we won't do that, said Mrs. Lancaster. I can't stand people always interfering. We're having such a nice little talk up here, aren't we? I think we'll just stay up here, oh dear. Now they're calling under the window. Just look out and see who it is. Tuppence went to the window. It's Mr. Perry, she said. From below, Mr. Perry shouted, Julia! Julia! Impertinent, said Mrs. Lancaster. I don't allow people like Amos Perry to call me by my Christian name. No, indeed. Don't worry, dear, she added. We're quite safe here. And we can have a nice little talk. I'll tell you all about myself. I've really had a very interesting life. Eventful. Sometimes I think I ought to write it down. I was mixed up, you see. I was a wild girl, and I was mixed up with, well, really just a common gang of criminals. No other word for it. Some of them very undesirable people. Mind you, there were nice people among them, quite good class. Miss Bly? No, Miss Bly never had anything to do with crime, not Nellie Bly. Oh, no, she's very churchy, you know, religious, all that. But there are different ways of religion. Perhaps you know that, do you? I suppose there are a lot of different sects, S-E-C-T-S, Tuppence suggested. Yes, there have to be for ordinary people, but there are others besides ordinary people. There are some special ones under special commands. There are special legions. Do you understand what I mean, my dear? I don't think I do, said Tuppence. Don't you think we ought to let the Perrys into their own house? They're getting rather upset. Hang on. No, we're not going to let the Perrys in. Not till I've told you all about it. You mustn't be frightened, my dear. It's all quite natural, quite harmless. There's no pain of any kind. It'll be just like going to sleep. Uh-oh, nothing worse. Tuppence stared at her, then she jumped up and went towards the door in the wall. You can't get out that way, said Mrs. Lancaster. You don't know where the catch is. It's not where you think it is at all. Only I know that. I know all the secrets of this place. I lived here with the criminals when I was a girl until I went away from them all and got salvation, special salvation. That's what was given to me to Expiate. Is that right? My sin, the child, you know, I killed it. I was a dancer. I didn't want a child. Over there on the wall, that's my picture as a dancer. Tuppence followed the pointing finger. On the wall hung an oil painting, full length, of a girl in a costume of white satin leaves with the legend Water Lily. Water Lily was one of my best roles. Everyone said so. Remember that boat in the picture? It was called Water Lily, wasn't it? Tuppence came back slowly and sat down. She stared at Mrs. Lancaster as she did so. Words repeated in her head, words heard at Sunny Ridge. Was it your poor child? She had been frightened then, frightened. She was frightened now. She was as yet not quite sure what she was frightened of, but the same fear was there. Looking at that benignant face, that kindly smile, I had to obey the commands given me. There have to be agents of destruction. I was appointed to that. I accepted my appointment. They go free of sin, you see. I mean, the children went free of sin. They were not old enough to sin, so I sent them to glory, as I was appointed to do so, still innocent, still not knowing evil. You can see what a great honor it was to be chosen. To be one of the specially chosen. I always loved children. I had none of my own. That was very cruel, wasn't it? Or it seemed cruel, but it was retribution, really, for what I'd done. You know, perhaps, what I'd done. No, said Tuppence. Oh, you seem to know so much. I thought perhaps you'd know that, too. There was a doctor. I went to him. I was only 17 then, and I was frightened. He said it would be all right to have the child taken away so nobody would ever know, but it wasn't all right, you see. I began to have dreams. I had dreams that the child was always there, asking me why it never had life. The child told me it wanted companions. It was a girl, you know. Yes, I'm sure it was a girl. She came and she wanted other children. Then I got the command I couldn't have any children. I'd married and I thought I'd have children. Then my husband wanted children passionately, but the children never came. Because I was cursed, you see. You understand, don't you? But there was a way to atone for what I'd done. What I'd done was murder, wasn't it? And you could only atone for murder with other murders. Because the other murders wouldn't be really murders. They would be sacrifices. They would be offered up. You do see the difference, don't you? The children went to keep my child company. Ugh. Children of different ages, but young. The command would come, and then she leaned forward and touched Tuppence. It was such a happy thing to do. So, she was the child killer? I must stop there. This is just too much. And my mouth is dry, and my teeth's gone. That was it. Yeah, it's still quite a bit to go. Oh, that's the last chapter. Well, I guess it would be. That's the last chapter. Wow. Wow. I gotta get back to where I was. Okay, there. All right, y'all have a great night. Hope to see you tomorrow at 5. Be sweet, don't be ugly.